On the lumpenproletariat. An historical reconstruction and a conceptual critique. March 26, 2019. By Walt Auerbach. Intransigence. Issue 4. Publication of Internationalist Communists in North America. The concept of the lumpenproletariat sits uneasily within Marxian class analysis. It is an unstable, even incoherent category, not only in terms of its theorization but at the level of social reality itself. Nowhere did Marx or Engels or their successors provide a rigorous or exhaustive account of lumpens as a group or lumpenization as a process. Rather, there are snippets of text which can be compiled regarding the lumpenproletariat's role in modern life. Politically, most Marxists would agree this role is negative, or rather has been at crucial junctures in the past. From the Lazzaroni of Naples in 1799 through the Garde Mobile of Paris in 1848 through the Garde Mobile up to the Tsarist in Russia after 1905 through the Garde Mobile and the fascist Sturmabteilung in Germany during the interwar period, through the Garde Mobile members of the lumpenproletariat have often served counter-revolutionary ends. At best, they are considered unreliable, at worst, predisposed to corruption. Either way, lumpens are not to be counted on when push comes to shove. Yet these are merely scattered instances, not an overarching framework of society. While perhaps of anecdotal significance, they cannot be used to predict how this segment of the populace would act in any given situation. Historic tendencies may of course be noted, but it is important not to make the present just an index of the moments that led up to it. Otherwise one risks lapsing into vulgar empiricism, always a temptation for historians. Moreover, communists must be extra careful when the concept is deployed against a backdrop like the migrant crisis. Condemnations of lumping criminality all too easily echo right-wing rhetoric about law and order. Such talking points are already pervasive in the media, with horror stories reported nightly on the news. Xenophobic and racist attitudes are fueled by middle-class fears of gang violence, which is but the flip side of police violence. Ultimately, crime itself is determined by whatever the bourgeois state deems to be legal or illegal at the time. A pair of recent articles have been published advancing a left communist approach to this question. Nuevo Curso examines the brutal effects of lumpenization in Spain alongside heightened xenophobia, while Workers' Offensive looks back on the glorification of the lumpenproletariat by the Black Panther Party in the US. Both articles raise a number of salient points, some of which bear repeating, but do so in a rather ham-fisted manner. Greater precision is required for their message to come across, if they want to avoid maudlin moralistic postures. What the present essay aims to accomplish is thus an historical reconstruction of the category, as well as a critique of its contemporary uses. It will be divided into 3 primary sections, each subdivided into 2 subsections. First, it will highlight some ambiguities in the Marxist definition of the lumpenproletariat to show how vague it is. These are not simply the result of confused thinking, either, but reflect the real messiness of life at the fringes of capitalism. Second, having clarified the core concept and furnished a material basis, its ideological function can now be laid bare from left to right. On both poles of the political spectrum, the figure of the lumpenproletariat is by turns glorified and vilified. Third, characteristically lumpen practices such as looting and rioting may then be interrogated to see whether they impede working-class militancy. Put otherwise, must revolution be on the table for counter-revolution to even be possible? Just to be clear, the goal here is not to place lumpenproletarians at the forefront of proletarian struggle or make them into the vanguard of the class. Still less does this essay want to replace the proletariat as the identical subject/object of history, as workers remain uniquely positioned to overthrow the capitalist system. Least of all does it seek to rehabilitate the lumpenproletariat as a group or deny how awful the process of lumpenization can be. Ambiguities. Reconstructing the category. By far the most thorough treatment of the concept of the lumpenproletariat was that of the American Trotskyist Hal Draper. In it he traces its derivation from the Latin proletariat, which itself was undergoing a profound transformation during the first few decades of the 19th century. The proletariat had not yet come to be fully identified with the emerging class of wage laborers, and retained some of its earlier connotations as a parasitic rabble, Pöbel. Marx and Engels gestured toward this in their jointly written German ideology, where they asserted that the plebeians of Rome, midway between freemen and slaves, never succeeded in becoming more than a lumpenproletariat. Quoting the prominent left Ricardian economist Sismondi, Marx explained many years later, whereas the Roman proletariat lived at the expense of society, modern society lives at the expense of the proletariat. For Marx and Engels, this reversal was constitutive of the difference between antiquity and capitalist modernity. Subsequent Marxists such as Nikolai Bukharin would sometimes express frustration at sociologists, who continue to confuse the proletariat with the lumpenproletariat well into the 20th century. Engels did suggest at one point, however, that an historic link existed between the two. Although the lumpenproletariat is a phenomenon which occurs in every phase of society known so far, it acquired a special status when feudalism began to decay. Near the end of his life, Engels held that these D-class elements comprised a sort of pre-proletariat. Perhaps the most famous line on the lumpenproletariat appears in the manifesto, where Marx and Engels warn of the dangerous class, or the social scum, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of the old society. They concede that it may, here and there, be swept into the movement by a proletarian revolution, but add that its conditions of life prepare it far more for the part of bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. Commentators have noted that their prediction came much too true during the revolutions of 1848 and after. Following the collapse of the short-lived Orleanist dynasty in March 1848, proletarian unrest started to make itself felt in the French capital. By June it had boiled over into full-blown insurrection, prompting a ruthless response from the government. Reporting on the situation, Engels wrote the Mobile Guard, which was recruited from the Paris lumpenproletariat, has already during its brief existence, thanks to good pay, been transformed into the Praetorians of power. The organized lumpenproletariat has given battle to the unorganized working proletariat. Vienna and Antwerp were the next European cities where the revolution was suppressed. In Paris the Mobile Guard, in Vienna the Croats, in both cases Lazzaroni, or the lumpenproletariat hired and armed, were used against the working and thinking proletarians, Marx recorded in the pages of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. Meanwhile, Engels commented on the court proceedings against Republicans in Belgium to the effect that workers could not have been among the ranks of the monarchists. Instead, he reasoned, it must have been les miserables. Who were the lumpenproletarians though? Of all the descriptions Marx wrote of this group, two stand out for their vividness. The first came midway through his polemical 1850 pamphlet Class Struggles in France, referring to quotation by Marx. The lumpenproletariat, which in big towns forms a mass sharply differentiated from the industrial proletariat, a recruiting ground for thieves and criminals of all kinds, living on the crumbs of society, people without a definite trade, vagabonds, gens sans fouet sans aveur, those without hearth or home, varying according to the degree of civilization of the nation to which they belong. But never renouncing their Lazzaroni character, at the tender age the provisional government recruited them, thoroughly malleable, as capable of performing the most heroic deeds and the most exalted sacrifices as of the basest banditry and the foulest corruption. End of quotation by Marx. And in the 18th Brumaire. Quotation by Marx. The lumpenproletariat of Paris was organized into secret sections, alongside decayed roués with dubious means of subsistence, alongside ruined and adventurous offshoots of the bourgeoisie, were vagabonds, discharged soldiers, jailbirds, escaped galley slaves, rogues, mountebanks, lazzaroni, pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, maquereaux, brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars, in short, the whole indefinite, disintegrated mass, thrown hither and thither, which the French famously term la bohème. End of quotation by Marx. Literary critics have dismissed this passage as a rhetorical flourish, an exercise in mid-19th century list-making and little else. But academic explanations of this sort no more suffice than efforts to ascribe these views to prejudices stemming from their social origins, to Marx's bourgeois outlook or his and Engels' middle-class Biedermeier mentality. Such facile dismissals explain nothing, assured as they are of the belief that today people know better. One of the more serious challenges to Marx and Engels' interpretation of 1848 has been mounted by historians of a sociological bent. Demographic data about the average age, occupation, and residence of the mobile guardsman casts doubt upon the official Marxist narrative. Quantitative research would seem to indicate that the class background was similar for combatants on either side of the barricade, with the main difference being generational. However, this objection, though grounded in painstaking archival work, is made in retrospect, and runs up against the preponderant perception of contemporary observers. These include many who actually participated in the uprising. Marx and Engels reviewed several memoirs written by professional conspirators, recalling firsthand their involvement in the events of 1848. Add to that the great wealth of artistic evidence left by Parisian witnesses, from Daumier's lumpenproletarian caricature Poil to the ragman of Baudelaire's intoxicated strolls. Furthermore, this focus on the lowest layer of the class leaves out a major aspect of Marx's original formulation. Namely, the rebirth of the lumpenproletariat on the heights of bourgeois society, within the Bonapartist state and the finance aristocracy. What he meant by this was not the ordinary crowd of lobbyists and speculators, who despite their lack of scruples normally operate inside the bounds of the law. Rather the schemers and scammers, the Charles Ponzis and Bernie Madoffs of the world, with long-standing connections to organized crime. Indeed, Louis Bonaparte himself was seen by Marx as some kind of princely lumpenproletarian, a petty crook who through guile and blind luck had risen to become head of state. Just as the lumpenproletariat would be enlisted against the workers as strikebreakers or scabs, cheap stand-ins, so too was Bonaparte a remplaçant, the substitute for Napoleon. Unquestionably Marx made generous use of metaphor and clever turns of phrase, but there was a very little dimension to his belief that Bonaparte was nothing more than a lumpen writ large. Definitional problems. Nevertheless, questions remain about the precise character of the lumpenproletariat. Above all, in terms of its class character, where does it fit into the Marxist theory of social classes? Properly speaking, is it even a class at all? How does it relate to other classic terms like surplus population and reserve army of labor, or neologisms like the precariat? Finally, what separates modern lumpens from pre-modern antecedents in more agrarian societies? Starting with the last question and then working backwards, a few words can be spared about the specificity of the phenomenon. Of course, as Marx and Engels pointed out, the lumpenproletariat was present in all recorded social configurations. But since this segment of society has always been concentrated primarily in cities, it follows that its presence would only increase with the shift to a more urban civilization like capitalism. Rising crime rates go hand in hand with the rapid growth of industrial centers and the societal upheaval that trails in its wake. Urban agglomerations have produced illnesses and epidemics, physical and criminal degeneration, the formation of the lumpenproletariat and of an underworld worse than the highwaymen of previous centuries, and the terrifying rise of all statistics relating to crime, remarked Amadeo Bordiga in 1952. It is fitting that a native Neapolitan would weigh in on the issue, given Marx's view of his hometown as the capital of Lazaranitum. Umano Ria, the late Italian essayist, claimed Naples was haunted by the ghosts of Bakunin, Bordiga, and the lumpens. Contrasting the Sicilian mafia with the Neapolitan Camorra, as Eric Hobsbawm for example did in Primitive Rebels, helps to underscore the difference between the lumpenproletariat and its precursors. The mafia in Sicily held sway outside Palermo, in the villas and villages beyond the reach of Bourbon or Piedmontese rule. Only in American cities like New York and Chicago did it adjust to an urban setting. Hobsbawm's study makes clear its stark contrast with the Camorra in Naples, which took shape in the jails, later forming the quintessential mob. Paris over the first half of the 19th century became virtually synonymous with metropolitan crime. Louis Chevalier, a skillful bourgeois historian, chronicled the pervasive theme of the dangerous classes in serial fiction by novelists like Jules Jardin, Honoré de Balzac, Victor Hugo, and Eugène Sue, all of whom Marx and Engels read avidly. For Chevalier, the very fact that detailed information was now being kept about the incidence and severity of crime, culminating in the modern science of criminology, attested to a social dynamic without precedent. Although he was wrong to insist on the singularity of Paris, other cities exhibited similar proclivities. Chevalier was right that the issue here was not crime itself so much as the pathological nature of urban living. Urbanization everywhere resulted in the creation of a permanent underclass which was quite distinct from the brigands and banditos of pre-capitalist times or the lawless frontier. Now its place in the social structure must be ascertained. Endnotes. Voice of the Anglophone Communization Milieu asks in the centerpiece to its fourth issue, what is the relationship between the surplus population and the lumpenproletariat? Are they one and the same? Marx expounds on the surplus population at length in Capital, but does not refer at all to the lumpenproletariat in that work. He uses the phrase only in his political writings. Strictly speaking, this last claim is inaccurate. D-class elements show up in the 25th chapter of that work, where they are put beneath the relative surplus population. Various Marxian theorists have schematized the relationship between the total workforce and the different levels of the relative surplus population, which includes the lumpenproletariat. In recent years, Tino Sukhotany has offered a serviceable breakdown of the latter. Bordiga provided a neat overview back in the 50s. 1. The active industrial army, or workers who have a job. 2. Floating surplus population, workers entering or leaving the factories in accordance with technical evolution and the changes it entails to the division of labor. 3. Latent surplus population, workers leaving the countryside for the factories because of the difficulty of life at the margins of agrarian economy. 4. Stagnant surplus population, which is only rarely called upon by big industry, domestic workers, travailleurs à domicile, workers employed in marginal activities for a very low salary. 5. Paupers, chronically unemployed, though able to work. Orphans and children of the poor. Disabled or unemployable persons, widows, etc. 6. Apart from the working class, in what is known as the lumpenproletariat, delinquents, prostitutes, the underworld, peg. No doubt this is a much more finely grained presentation of the lumpenproletariat and its place within Marx's network of categories. Yet the matter is by no means exhausted by this schematic, as it conflicts with some of the other definitions cited above. Is the lumpenproletariat part of the proletariat proper? Or is it made up of pre-capitalist survivals? This last question is connected with the unresolved issue of lumpenization, whether it was a one-off or is an ongoing process. Further confusion attaches to recent buzzwords like casualization and precarization. Guy Standing's newly minted notion of the precariat is a case in point. Although he states that this term is not identical to the Marxist concept of the lumpenproletariat, Standing complicates things by referring to it as another class dangerous in the subtitle to his book. Moreover, precarity is a feature of both proletarian and lumpenproletarian life. While it is important to distinguish precarization from lumpenization, as Nuevo Curso suggests, it is not enough to state this fact without elaborating on it. Each of these processes has to be spelled out. Sooner or later one wonders if the lumpenproletariat is a class in its own right, or simply a subclass of a larger class. Here and there Marx and Engels referred to it as a classer, but for the most part they saw it as utterly declassed, as the scum, offal, and refuse of all classes or the depraved elements from all classes. Later Engels would get more specific about the class origins of those thus declassed, writing in 1874. Quotation by Engels. In French, the declasses are people of the propertied classes who were ousted or who broke away from that class without thereby becoming proletarians, such as business adventurers, rogues, and gamblers. Most of them professional literati or politicians, etc. The proletariat, too, has its D-class elements, making up the lumpenproletariat. End of quotation by Engels. Beforehand the literati had been listed by Marx under the rubric of the lumpenproletariat, but it would appear Engels reclassified them as lumpenbourgeois. Regardless, another ambiguity arises insofar as the degree of differentiation between lumpens and regular proles is left unclear. Marx at one point wrote the two were already sharply differentiated, but later in the same paragraph said this was only due to the uniforms given them by the bourgeois authorities. However, the government clearly had to play off one part of the proletariat against the other. Depending on how one chooses to count, there are only 2 or 3 pure classes in capitalism. Society as a whole is more and more split between 2 great hostile camps, 2 great classes directly facing each other, Marx and Engels contended in the manifesto, proletariat and bourgeoisie. Georg Lukács later added. Quotation by Lukács. Proletariat and bourgeoisie are the only pure classes in bourgeois society, the only classes whose entire existence and development are dependent on the course charted by modern production. It is only from the vantage point of these classes that a plan for the total organization of society can even be imagined. The outlook of the other classes is ambiguous or sterile, because their existence is not based exclusively on a role in the capitalist system. End of quotation by Lukács. A third relatively pure class could be added to this dichotomy, following Marx's argument in the final volume of Capital put out by Engels. Workers, capitalists, and landowners form the 3 great classes of modern society based on the capitalist mode of production. Of course, these classes line up with the 3 constituent parts of the Trinity formula that Marx had just finished discussing a few chapters prior, i.e. wages, profits, and ground rent. Even the petite bourgeoisie is not a pure class according to Lukács, stricto sensu, belonging in the final analysis to the bourgeoisie, as its name suggests. Like the grande bourgeoisie, it has access to the means of production necessary to reproduce its own existence. Unlike the grande bourgeoisie, it lacks the capital to employ others to work these same means. For the most part it is divided into upwardly and downwardly mobile portions, which are either impoverished or enriched until they merge with the mass of workers or join with the capitalists. Given that it tends to be absorbed into these purer classes, why does the petite bourgeoisie prove such a resilient feature of capitalism? To begin with, the ranks of the petite bourgeoisie are replenished through periodic crises. Capitalists will buy up bankrupt mom-and-pop shops, small-time businesses that have gone under. But workers who have scrimped and scrounged will also often have a go at being an independent proprietor. It is somewhat analogous in the case of lumpens, though this is decidedly less of an aspirational status than petit bourgeois. With the lumpenproletariat, however, its position vis-à-vis the social structure of capitalism is more paradoxical than with the petite bourgeoisie. Lumpens in a quite tangible sense find themselves outside of capitalist society, or at least beyond its legal bounds. Yet at the same time, their plight is a byproduct of the very system from which they are excluded. Border cases abound as well. How does one classify those who work 9-to-5 jobs but sling dope on the side to supplement their shitty wages? Perhaps this is what makes them so difficult to define. Polarities. Leftists and the lumpenproletariat. Debates over the revolutionary potential of the lumpenproletariat have raged from the foundation of the first Working Men's International onward. Since the 1860s, then, many have diverged from Marx's deprecatory view of the lumpenproletariat, with some even going so far as to assert that this miserable stratum is more predisposed to anti-capitalism than its industrial counterpart. Mikhail Bakunin, the voice of anarchist politics during this period, was the earliest to articulate this view. Even Marxists, however, above all Maoists, subsequently followed suit. A quick note on terminology. Regarding leftism and the left, in recent decades the left/right distinction has been attacked at times as obsolete. Other times it has been defended as still relevant. Whole books have been written that recast the history of the left as a struggle to forge democracy, or else a critique of everyday life. Communist dissidents have tried to conceptualize the left as a movement of negation toward the existent world, which tends toward total emancipation. Though occasionally interesting, these efforts prove to be inadequate. Right and left might retain relative validity in the sense that one thing can be to the left of another thing, or that something can be criticized from the left. German, Dutch, and Italian communists could thus be said to represent the left wing of the early Comintern. Kantianism was similarly susceptible to materialist criticism. Later on, the left, with a capital letter, acquired quasi-metaphysical properties as an entity unto itself, a catch-all encompassing everything from mass social democratic parties to Leninist sects to tiny anarchist cells and much else besides. Usually this is further broken up into an Old Left, 1923 to 1956, New Left, 1956 to 1989, and Post-Political Left, 1989 present, commonly disparaged by communists as the left wing of capital. Prior to 1923, it is somewhat anachronistic to refer to anarchists, social democrats, and revolutionary Marxists under this generic rubric. But since the controversy between Bakunin and Marx over the lumpenproletariat, carried on by their followers over the next 50 years, was so decisive for the debates that ensued, it is worth reviewing their polemics. Marx and Engels only grew more intransigent, some scholars noticed, on the subject of lumpens as time went on. Quarreling with Bakunin had made matters worse. All the depravities in which the life of declassed individuals ejected from society inevitably become involved are proclaimed to be so many ultra-revolutionary virtues, Marx and Engels sarcastically sniped, without mentioning Bakunin by name. They continued. Quotation by Marx and Engels. Economic and political struggle on the part of the workers for their emancipation is replaced by the pan-destructive acts of heroes of the underworld, this latest incarnation of revolution. In a word, one must let loose the street hooligans suppressed by the workers themselves in revolutions on the Western classical model, and thus place gratuitously at the disposal of the reactionaries a well-disciplined gang of agents provocateurs. End of quotation by Marx and Engels. Bakunin replied. Quotation by Bakunin. Nowhere are there more favorable conditions for the social revolution than in Italy. For there does not exist in Italy, as in most other European nations, a special category of relatively affluent workers, earning higher wages, boasting of their literary capacities, and impregnated by a variety of bourgeois prejudices such that accepting income they differ in no way from the bourgeoisie. In Italy, it is the extremely poor proletariat that predominates, of whom Marx speaks disdainfully, quite unjustly, as a lumpenproletariat. Only in them, and not in the bourgeois strata of workers, is there crystallized the intelligence and power of the coming revolution. End of quotation by Bakunin. Here what ought to jump out at readers is how closely Bakunin's description of workers approximates the category of the labor aristocracy developed by Marx and Engels in the Anglo-Saxon context just a few years down the road. More will be said about this in the conclusion, but for now it is enough to point out the similarity. The Bakuninist lumpenproletariat was far more capacious than that of Marx or Engels, including the romantic figure of the Cossack. Although outlaws, these adventurers were often conscripted into Tsarist regiments to restore order. Victor Serge went over this disagreement in a 1938 reflection on anarchist thought. Bakunin, who seems to have never truly understood Marx, in certain regards was unable to shake specifically Russian ideas concerning the role of the underworld in the coming revolution, commented Serge, attributing a useful and important function to the declasses, outlaws, and bandits. Learning from the experience of the industrial countries, Marx knew that the lumpenproletariat, the subproletariat or the rabble of the big cities, was inclined to serve counter-revolution. Karl Kautsky featured a salutary reference to lumpens in his popular textbook on the class struggle, one half of the Epoch Lehrfeld program, 1890. In this work, as well as his disquisition on the agrarian question, 1900, they are described as prone to drunkenness and debauchery owing to their miserable situation. Politically, the lumpenproletarian ideal is a communism of consumption, not of production. Among the many Marxists who read and appreciated this treatise by Kautsky was Vladimir Lenin, who defended it from the self-styled critics of Marx. During and immediately after the 1905 revolution in Russia, Marxists sought to make sense of the violent anti-Semitic riots that broke out following the brief revolutionary efflorescence. The social composition of the pogromists had yet to be ascertained. Lenin saw in this reactionary backlash the hand of the lumpenproletariat, which bore the ideological imprint of anarchism. Rosa Luxemburg echoed this sentiment. Quotation by Luxemburg. What is the actual role of anarchism in the Russian Revolution? It has become the sign of the common thief and plunderer. A large proportion of the innumerable thefts and acts of plunder of private persons are carried out under the name of anarcho-communism, acts rising up like a troubled wave against the revolution in every period of depression and temporary defensive. Anarchism has become not the theory of the struggling proletariat, but the ideological signboard of the counter-revolutionary lumpenproletariat, which swarms like a school of sharks in the slipstream of the battleship of revolution, ending its whole historical career. End of quotation by Luxemburg. Her scorn for this protean social element did not stop there, however. She further derided the various demonstrations of the patriotic lumpenproletariat carried out under police patronage. Most of her views on the matter were second-hand, cribbed from Russian Marxist dispatches. By Luxemburg's own admission, the idea that anarchism is the ideology of the lumpenproletariat was already expressed by Georgy Plekhanov in his German brochures. Justified though it may once have been as a reproach to the likes of Bakunin or Nechayev, the charge that lumpen somehow formed the natural constituency of anarchists was already outdated by 1905. Not only in Western Europe, either, where an ascendant labor movement had given rise to syndicalism. In Russia as well, anarcho-syndicalists denounced the Nekivist tactics of conspiratorial societies and derided their faith in the revolutionary capacity of thieves, tramps, the lumpenproletariat, and other dark factors. Paul Auerbach has documented this well. These debates all lurked in the background when the issue was again taken up by segments of the New Left, especially those involved in anti-colonial and anti-racist struggles. Franz Fanon saw in lumpens the most spontaneously and radically revolutionary forces of a colonized people, even though their presence in urban centers along the capitalist periphery was a sign of the irreversible rot and gangrene eating into the heart of colonial domination. Despite signaling this decay, Fanon nevertheless held out hope that. Quotation by Fanon. The pimps, hooligans, unemployed, and petty criminals when approached will give the liberation struggle all they've got, devoting themselves to the cause like valiant workers. Vagrants will find their way back to the nation thanks to decisive militant action. Unchanged in the eyes of colonial society or vis-à-vis the moral standards of the colonizer, this jobless species of subhumans believe the gun or the hand grenade is the only way to re-enter the cities, and thus redeem itself before history. Likewise with the prostitutes, the domestics at 2,000 francs a month, the hopeless cases, the men and women who fluctuate between madness and suicide. Restored to sanity, they return to action amidst the great march of a nation on the move. End of quotation by Fanon. Yet elsewhere Fanon vacillated, fearing that lumpens could easily be conscripted as irregulars and used to crush rebellion. If the insurrection thinks it can afford to ignore the lumpenproletariat, this famished underclass will pitch itself into armed struggle on the side of the oppressor, he worried, paraphrasing the manifesto. Many authors sympathetic to Fanon, for example his biographer David Macy, saw him as incredibly naive on this score. Any Marxist knew well that the lumpenproletariat would not play a progressive role in the event of a revolution. Just a few years later in the US, the Black Panther Party also adopted a more optimistic stance with regard to these social outcasts. Partly inspired by Fanon, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale went against settled orthodoxy on this issue. "We'd argue with our Marxist friends," the latter later recalled, who felt lumpens never did anything but pillage and ignore the revolutionary cause altogether. Seale once quipped that Marx and Lenin would probably turn over in their graves if they saw lumpenproletarians and their role within the ideology of the BPP. Newton's gloss on the category was quite idiosyncratic, defined as the left wing of the proletariat. He felt that the lumpenproletariat alone possessed the potential to act as the vanguard, carrying the people toward the final climax of the transformation of society. For Newton, automation was leading to structural unemployment on an expanded scale. Lumpenproletarians in the near future will be the popular majority, he predicted. This then led him to assert in 1971 that the lumpenproletariat is the majority, and hoists the revolutionary banner. Eldridge Cleaver, one of this doctrine's original authors, argued that productive technologies would eventually bring about the lumpenization of humanity. Upon his expulsion from the BPP, a year or so after Newton's speech at Boston College, Cleaver took this argument further. Marxism has had a disastrous effect upon the revolutionary movement, he maintained late in 1972, misunderstanding the basic nature of oppression. It wrongly identified the proletariat or the working class as the most radical element of society, when it is in fact the lumpen. Workers' offensive was thus right to assert, glorifying the lumpenproletariat, as the BPP did, has more in common with Bakunin than with Marx. As the Marxist historian Manning Marable observed, this was an equal but opposite mistake to more milquetoast New Left groups such as the SDS. Social Democrats tend to substitute white students and professionals for the traditional working class, wrote Marable. Neo-Bakuninists make the same error, in the other direction, by exalting the black lumpenproletariat as the main force of social revolution. Criticizing the BPP is a tricky matter in the US, where the memory of its martyrdom is still present. Very few organizations have been so enduringly mythologized. Regardless, it is important that the BPP be susceptible to criticism like any left-wing political party. The International Communist Party provided an even-handed appraisal in 1971, one which took stock of the persecution it suffered at the hands of the police. Quotation by the ICP. Here is an attempt to adjust theory and practice to this social category, searching for fresh strength, a unique path to revolution via the very reasons that the lumpenproletariat has been historically impotent. So the lumpenproletariat, having no opportunity to boycott production by means of a strike and forced to clash in the streets, is seen as more revolutionary. Yet the BPP seems unaware that this also entails inevitable defeat. End of quotation by the ICP. Black Panther ideology was straitjacketed from the start by an ill-fitting patchwork of Maoist, Uche, and adjacent notions. Maoism came to Newton and Seal courtesy of the FBI snitch Richard Aoki. It ought to be added parenthetically, of course, none of this is meant to denigrate the legacy of the BPP or belittle its accomplishments. Fervent admirers of the group have even cited the effort to recruit among the lumpenproletariat as a crucial misstep, one which invited violence into its internal culture and gave federal authorities another excuse to monitor it. Attitudes of reactionaries toward the lumpen. Various post-left, i.e., post-anarchist and post-Marxist, musings about the lumpenproletariat may be bracketed for now and dealt with in the final section. Reactionary attitudes toward this marginalized segment of society will instead be examined here, to see how it figured into the historical narrative and cultural tropes of right-wing ideology. Conservatives rarely thought of lumpens in explicitly social terms, though, preferring to look for explanations elsewhere. Specifically, they tended to displace the class stratification that results from capitalist production onto a pre-existing racial hierarchy. In other words, the uneven outcomes of universalized competition can be chalked up to congenital laziness/industriousness or other heritable traits. Jews, for example, are seen as preternaturally thrifty and cunning, stereotyped as shopkeepers or well-to-do professionals, as lawyers, doctors, or whatnot. Latinos and blacks are by contrast depicted as shiftless ne'er-do-wells, associated with chronic unemployment and urban crime waves. Whenever a dominant racial or ethnic group experiences economic insecurity, or feels threatened by impoverishment, its worst fears and resentments are channeled by right-wing ideologues into hatred of immigrants and minorities. Xenophobia and racism flow from real premises, but are distorted through an ideological prism. Either way, these prejudices substitute Rassenkampf for Klassenkampf. Marxists do not seek to defend the petite bourgeoisie or lumpenproletariat as such, but attack campaigns specifically targeting Jewish proprietors or Black and Latino gangs. Psychology offers a convenient dyad that captures the reactionary position on lumpenproletarians: attraction/repulsion. Attracted by their brutality, the ease with which they resort to force. Repulsed by their degenerate behavior, how soon they succumb to vices like whoring, gambling, and drink. Beyond any of this, however, reactionaries view lumpens either as a pool of available enforcers there to uphold the existing order or as a ready-made scapegoat on which all sorts of chaos can be blamed. This duality will be evident in the survey of reaction that follows. 1905 once again serves as a benchmark, helping gauge the role of different groups in moments of upheaval. Luxemburg vividly described the patriotism exhibited by lumpen elements, police informers, plainclothesmen, and other hangers-on holding aloft a portrait of the Tsar. She continued in another weekly column. Quotation by Luxemburg. From all the cities, all the regions, from every corner of the empire come news reports of murder and looting, anti-Jewish rampages, and other bestial excesses by the police, the Cossacks, and the soldiers. Yet again Tsarism has resorted to its tried and true, favorite method of fighting the revolutionary movement. It stirs up the dregs of society, or lumpenproletariat, trying to drown the vanguard of the working class in a sea of blood. End of quotation by Luxemburg. According to the Tsarist administrator of Kiev, the mob that ransacked the city in October of that year was made up of such unsavory characters, urchins, vagabonds, and assorted riffraff. It was mostly they who did the plundering. Demographic inferences gathered from eyewitness testimony corroborate this account. Hooliganism came to refer almost exclusively to the pogromist lifestyle in the Pale of Settlement, where Jews were confined. Whether or not the ragged Black Hundred hordes constituted a fascist or proto-fascist force is an open question, though some have already answered in the affirmative. Less controversial is the claim that the paramilitary Freikorps, unleashed against the unruly Spartakusbund in January 1919, prefigured Nazism in Germany. Recent studies confirm that a large portion of the Freikorps membership was seen by contemporaries as lumpen and work-shy, Arbeitsschulen. Even the officers in command of such units regarded the rank and file as difficult to control. Other historians, mostly during the Soviet period, diagnosed the class composition of the Freikorps as lumpenproletarian and petit bourgeois, two groups ripe for fascism, in the classic Marxian view. German communists at the time referred to the murderers of Luxemburg and Liebknecht as lumpen scoundrels. As Gilles Dauve points out, however, this appellation cut both ways. Friedrich Ebert and the ruling Social Democrats sought to discredit the Spartacists as the party of the lumpenproletariat, as if any opposition to parliamentarism sowed disorder. The right wing of the workers' movement, the MSPD, falsely accused the Spartacists of lumpenism while employing actual lumpens to stamp out their uprising. Here the double motion of repulsion and attraction is laid bare. World War I trained an entire generation of able-bodied men to fight, and now a huge swathe of unemployed ex-servicemen with deadly skill sets return to ruined economies bitter at their fate. Right-wing veterans such as the avant-garde novelist Ernst Junger speculated about the role they might play. Quotation by Junger. Bakunin was right in regarding the lumpenproletariat as a much more effective revolutionary force than the working masses. Seen from another side, one can say it's enough to disperse the masses, while the lumpenproletariat must be sought out in its hiding places. Its greater effectiveness furthermore suggests that it owns a real battle plan, the age-old formation of the pack. The lumpenproletariat's relation to pain is also more substantial, if no doubt negative. For while the masses kill with machines, tearing apart and trampling underfoot, the lumpenproletariat is directly familiar with the joys of torture. Whereas the masses are moved morally, united in indignation at injustice and evil, the lumpenproletariat is beyond all moral valuations and thus always and everywhere ready to seize the opportunity, with any disturbance of the social order. One must regard the lumpenproletariat as a kind of underground army reserve the social order keeps on alert. It is to be noted parenthetically here that the word lumpenproletariat, as the attentive reader will have not failed to notice, belongs to the outdated vocabulary of class struggle. Yet we are dealing here with an elementary force, which is always present and naturally concealed behind a mask of established economic thought. Today, this elementary force appears in new forms associated with other such forces active in political movements and military actions. Above all, we refer to the appearance of the partisan, who to a great extent has already lost all social hue. Partisans are assigned missions carried out beneath the legal order, surfacing at the rear of invading armies, where operations involve espionage, sabotage, and subversion. During a civil war, the operations left to partisans include missions beyond the bounds of law, which are especially ruthless. End of quotation by Ernst Jünger. Clearly, the revolution this passage had in mind was not a communist one. Jünger was the exemplar of reactionary modernism and an advocate of conservative revolution. Ex-soldiers supplied the bulk of fascism's street-fighting squadrons, the black shirts in Italy and brown shirts in Germany. Of all the varied walks of life Marx categorized as lumpenproletarian, the discharged soldier is perhaps the most easily forgotten. However, one need only think of groups like the 3%ers in the US today to get a sense of their potential counter-revolutionary use. August Thalheimer, one of the first Marxists to theorize fascism, ventured that it was a kind of Redux Bonapartism as early as 1923. Fascism, like Bonapartism before it, pretends to act on behalf of the whole nation, incorporating a range of influences. Its social composition consists of ejected elements from all classes, wrote Thalheimer, the nobility, the bourgeoisie, the petite bourgeoisie, the peasantry, and the working class. With the working class, two opposite yet related D-class poles are present: below, the lumpenproletariat; above, the labor aristocracy. Trotsky concurred with this diagnosis in his account of how Mussolini triumphed, 1932, where he asserted, no longer able to hold society in a state of equilibrium through its usual police resources and parliamentary screens, fascism rushes to the defense of bourgeois dictatorship. By means of the fascist agency, capitalism sets into motion the masses of the crazed petite bourgeoisie along with bands of the declassed and demoralized lumpenproletariat. All of the countless human beings finance capital itself has brought to the precipice of despair. Likewise, the Italian communist Angelo Tasca maintained that while the petite bourgeoisie formed the backbone of fascism in Italy, this had to be granted a wider ambit to include the son of the family waiting for a job or for his inheritance to declass of all kinds, temporary or permanent, from the half-pay officer to the lumpenproletariat. However, it fell to the German left communist Arthur Rosenberg to connect the dots between the black hundreds in Russia, black shirts in Italy, and brown shirts in Germany. Quotation by Arthur Rosenberg. In the autumn of 1905 the Black Hundreds committed some 4,000 murders through hundreds of Russian towns, to say nothing of all their other crimes. As far as its scale is concerned, this movement of the true Russian peoples can certainly be compared with the more recent actions of the black shirts and brown shirts. At a time of enormous revolutionary tension, when millions of workers were on strike in Russia, when in innumerable villages there were peasant rebellions, and the soldiers and sailors were starting to mutiny, it was still possible for the ruling class to enlist hundreds of thousands of impoverished elements as stormtroopers of the counter-revolution. Hatred of Jews, a stupid and fanatical nationalism, bribery, and alcohol all combined to pull together petty bourgeois, lumpenproletarians, and occasionally even right-wing workers. The possibility of stealing and plundering with total impunity drove hordes of professional criminals into fascism's ranks. End of quotation by Arthur Rosenberg. Many Marxists saw the rise of fascism in terms directly analogous to mob violence. Bertolt Brecht, for example, likened Hitler's ascension to that of a Chicago mobster in his 1941 play The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui. Ui, a kind of Al Capone figure, rose from local boss of the outskirts of Cicero to take over the big city. The world was almost ruled by such a crook. Statistics bear out the idea that fascists recruited heavily from lumpenized segments of the population, especially their SA units, which engaged in quasi-gangland street warfare with communists. In terms of the recipients of fascist aggression, the enemy was often portrayed in mass propaganda as lumpenproletarian. Particularly the Roma minority, both in urban centers and wandering along their periphery. Gunter Louis explains in The Nazi Persecution of the Gypsies that this was the rationale given for clearing away squats and caravans outside Dusseldorf in 1936. Robert Ritter, an expert on the gypsy problem, as it was known, for the most part saw them as social parasites and habitual criminals, representing a highly inferior lumpenproletariat. Jews were less automatically associated with the underclass than their fellow Untermenschen, but the fascists aimed to fix this. The National Socialist plan to force what remains of the Jews down into the lumpenproletariat shows how well its authors know the environment, recorded Max Horkheimer in 1939. Once Jews have become shabby, they will no longer even benefit from the fleeting sentiment of bourgeois class solidarity, the outrage that even rich people are not safe. Horkheimer viewed this as an essential step in the Jews' dehumanization. No doubt there were genuine Jewish lumpens, from the characters in Isaac Babel's Odessa Tales to real-life gangsters like Benny Siegel and Meyer Lansky. But the point here is that the Nazis felt the need to relegate Jews to this lowly status, while at the same time drawing upon the dregs of German society for foot soldiers. Lumpenization took its toll on the Jews of Europe, breaking their spirit of resistance and insubordination. Even outside of the camps, struggles are rarely waged by the lumpenproletariat, noted Primo Levi. People in rags do not revolt. Around the same time and for some decades prior, white lynch mobs perpetrated numerous acts of terror across the United States. Race riots often featured lumpen participants. For instance, in 1863 draft riots broke out in NYC that saw hundreds killed and thousands injured. Dozens of black residents were hanged from lampposts or murdered in the streets. Herbert Asprey wrote in Gangs of New York, 1928, that the riots were an insurrection of the criminal element against the established order, an almost perfect description of political lumpenism. The original post-bellum Ku Klux Klan was largely composed of Confederate veterans, and so might be seen in the same light as later fascist paramilitaries. Petty bourgeois notables were often attracted to the Klan as well, despite its reputation for rowdiness, and together they led a grim insurgency against Reconstruction in the South. 50 years after it was founded, the Klan was reborn in 1915 from a wide array of social forces. Most were local businessmen, or else middling professionals. Very few could be called lumpens, their reactionary populism aside. Only after the KKK's decline circa 1928 did its membership begin to depend on more disreputable types. Conmen and thugs. This was how the SPLC described the leadership and the rank and file of the 1970s Klan, respectively. White supremacist prison outfits like the Aryan Brotherhood also quite obviously fall under the lumpenproletarian heading. Yet in spite of their own overtly criminal character, racists in such organizations continued to decry black and Hispanic youths as dangerous born criminals, prone to all sorts of so-called thuggish behavior. Here again one sees the simultaneous attraction and repulsion of reactionaries toward the lumpen, attraction to anyone down on his luck who belongs to an ethnic or racial majority, repulsion to anyone down on his luck who belongs to an ethnic or racial minority. Nuevo Curso observes their tendency to blame lumpenization on some of its imminent victims. A prime example of this would seem to be the right-wing representation of migrants from Central America as potential MS-13 members, when a number of them are in fact fleeing cartel violence. Further exploration of the lumpenproletariat concept will have to appear in a second installment, which will cover its use in contemporary post-Marxist and communization literature. Riots, looting, and popular fronts remain to be investigated. Special thanks to John Locks and Red Hughes for conversations that helped parse this whole fraught subject.